All right. Everybody, hello. My name is Isham Ford, for those of you who don't know me. I'm the Fred J. Hansen Peace Chair, and this is our inaugural lecture of the year. This is also being done in conjunction with Econ 404, Economics of Inequality, and as one will see, the topics that our esteemed lecturer will be discussing certainly touch on a lot of aspects of this. So we are very lucky to have Dr. Ibrahim Al-Marashi with us today. He's an associate professor of Middle East history at Cal State San Marcos and an advisory board member of the International Security and Conflict Resolution Program here at SDSU. He obtained his doctorate in modern history at the University of Oxford, completing a thesis on the Iraqi invasion of Kuwait. Part of it was actually plagiarized by the British government prior to the 2003 Iraq War, was known as the Dodgy Dossier. So he is co-author of Iraq's Armed Forces and Analytical History in 2008, The Modern History of Iraq from 2017, and A Concise History of the Middle East, concise, in 2018. So our topic today is the weaponization of water and climate migration in the Middle East, contested rivers, aquifers, and dams from Iraq, Egypt, and Ethiopia to the current Israel-Palestine crisis. So before I turn it over to Professor Al-Marashi, our next Hansen event is going to be in 2 days. This same time, different room. We are co-sponsored with the Center for War and Society, discussion about why Iraq still matters. So that's then. This is now. Dr. Al-Marashi, please.
Thank you. So again, I just wanted to extend my thanks to the Hansen Chair for sponsoring me, as well as the Center for Islamic and Arabic Studies, and as well as for Professor Fawad's invitation to give this lecture. I will begin with basically how am I going to set up this story. It's hubris to talk about water in the Middle East within a little bit more than an hour. So what I'm trying to do is give more or less a history up to the present where I'm situating water as the central protagonist to the story of the Middle East, as well as how it serves as kind of the background of various episodes and conflicts in the region. Of course, this is the chair in peace. So basically, we're going to look at not only peace, but latent and obviously violent conflicts over water resources. But I begin this story with a picture here. This is a Lebanese singer named Sabah. It's who my mother is named after. And Sabah is reading on the front page a magazine article about an Egyptian singer named Abd al-Halim Hafez, the Elvis of the Middle East. And unfortunately, his life was cut short because Abd al-Halim was infected by a fluke. Now, a fluke is not what you get when you didn't study before an exam and get an A. A fluke is a worm that you get from untreated water in the Nile. And so what cut his life short was a disease that emerges in the waters of the Nile. And the other story I'm going to tell you is not just of water, but public health. The access to water, how clean water is also a matter dealing particularly with the economics of inequality. One of the greatest challenges in the Middle East is being able to access clean water. And not only now, but definitely going into the future, particularly in the face of climate change. In Egypt's history, the 3 greatest funerals were for its leader Jamal Abdel Nasser, a singer named Kulthum, as well as Abd al-Halim Hafez, whose life was cut short by a disease caused by a fluke. So with that story, let's begin with the problems. Problems in the Middle East include drought. You might be thinking of the drought in Syria that led to the Syrian civil war. Problems include at this moment earthquakes. Okay, think of the earthquakes that hit both Turkey and Syria earlier this year. Countries that have to import grain. Poor leadership, bloated bureaucracies, displaced people. refugees fleeing to Europe. You might know a lot about these. And then, of course, military conflicts and invasions. Now, of course, I'm tricking you. I'm not talking about the present. I'm actually talking about a series of events that led to the collapse of the Bronze Age. Now, I do this for a reason, and sorry, I'm just gonna try to get. Okay, so the collapse of the Bronze Age. And you see a lot of similar dynamics, what basically are where a group of refugees were collectively known as the Sea Peoples. Look at the movements, a lot of similarities, but I also just found it interesting that I had prepared this lecture before October 7th, but I just put a particular square here because you might now be hearing about these locations in the news in the present. So when we're talking about the collapse of the Bronze Age, there's conveniently a date here. Let me see here if I can move this banner. There we go. Okay, that's much better. So, but I want you to think, have you heard these places in the news today? Gaza, Ashkelon, Ashdod. Okay, this is where we're talking about 1200 to 1150 BC and the series of crises that happened, a confluence of events. You probably haven't heard of Megiddo, but if I told you its English rendition, Armageddon, Armageddon is not an event, it's actually a place north of Jerusalem. So I begin with the Bronze Age collapse. Okay? And of course, a lot of these problems course, persist in the present. I'm not saying history is repeating itself, but I'm just kind of giving you an idea that the confluence of these events might take place over a span of decades. Okay. Now, not only are these events far back in time, but I also just want to make these events more palpable to you by situating them in the present. That the same issues that over water and contamination in the Middle East. If you think of the problems that are happening again in the beginning of this year, the contamination across the border between Mexico and San Diego, Tijuana and San Diego, I should be saying, is also a current issue in the current. Hi, hello, thank you for coming. A current problem right now. With another border, the border between Gaza and Israel is also facing these same issues of sewage infrastructure being damaged or deliberately targeted, cross-contamination. This is not only an issue locally, but transnationally as well. So let's begin with this piece of geography that's known as the Fertile Crescent. So just so that you know, the Fertile Crescent is a term that was not invented in the Middle East. It was actually invented by an American archaeologist at the University of Chicago, trying to find a way to describe an antiquity. The series of rivers and civilizations that emerged within what is Mesopotamia, today's Iraq, reaching all the way to Egypt. And he came up, for the lack of a better term, he said, with the Fertile Crescent. Even though it's not a term developed in the Middle East, it's a useful metaphor, and it's also symbolic because the Fertile Crescent was an area that he used to describe a geographical region, right? I like this map provided by former San Diego State University, Sami, a fellow Iraqi, because this map from antiquity here, when you take away the borders, the modern borders today, you really get an appreciation of what is called the Fertile Crescent from the Gulf. Now, remember, the Gulf was proceeded much further into inland in what is modern day Iraq. But again, from the headway in what is today Turkey, we could see when he described it as a Fertile Crescent that this archaeologist perhaps is looking at a map like this. And this is the journey we're going to be taking from the waters here, then reaching to this area here known as Levant and the waters that go here, and then we'll end up in the Nile and finally finish our journey in neighboring Libya. So we go from this map I know who didn't do that. Okay. So we begin with, okay, of course, with water. This is a cylinder coming from Sumeria, and I begin this story with the worship of the crescent moon, a symbol of fertility. The crescent moon is a symbol that comes to us as a symbol of fertility. It was considered a god in ancient Sumeria. So what is considered one of the very first civilizations emerged because of the confluence of the Tigris and Euphrates. Of course, the moon was sacred because this was the goddess of fertility, so much so that the Sumerians named the day after this goddess, Moon Day, otherwise what we know as Monday, okay? It was this goddess of fertility that ensured the waters flowed, because the waters flow, you could have the first cultivation of, organized agriculture in these civilizations. And just you probably don't know it, that even with the Sumerians and the way they venerated the crescent as a goddess of fertility, you probably don't realize it, but notice whenever you see the Virgin Mary, this is an image of the Virgin of Guadalupe, she's always standing on a crescent, okay? And this is kind of one of the layovers. So, of course, the Virgin of Guadalupe was painted in the 1700s, but this is actually the Sumerian fertility goddess, a symbol that carried over into Christian iconography. And of course, kind of a divine feminine. It wouldn't be surprising that eventually the crescent would be incorporated into our imagery. So it's not only an image, of course, that you see in Christianity, okay? But people often don't realize the symbol of Islam. Usually, historically, the Virgin Mary, the symbol of fertility and the control of the rivers, was abbreviated with a crescent and a star, which today is associated as a symbol of Islam, but actually historically it was the symbol of the Virgin Mary. Keep in mind the Muslims also venerate the Virgin Mary as well. So we go from Sumeria, let's also go to telling the story of the role water played in history, that understanding the life of the historical Jesus. So what I'm going to do is more or less give you a mini class on the role water plays in Middle Eastern history and politics, with a lot of readings for the future. So if any of these articles are of interest for you, they're meant to be, take a picture of it, follow them up. But climate, droughts, war, and famine. So we went from the Sumerians to the fertility goddess's representation with the Virgin Mary. Now let's go to her son Jesus. And that even the story of water forms a backdrop to the life of the historical Jesus. So now let's go back to the Sumerian civilization. And locations here that we see, remember the Gulf was much further inland, but this is what's considered the first civilization. Now, the term civilization itself is problematic. We'll get to that later, but I want you to look at this map here and then compare it to the next map in terms of the role that these rivers played in the history of this particular part of the earth. Dilmun is today known as Bahrain. Okay? And this is supposed to be reputed the location of the historical Garden of Eden. Okay, or it's supposed to be the legendary birthplace of Abraham. Okay? And then, of course, other places here, the legendary Babylon. Okay, is located here, and this serves as the setting and the beginning of our story. So we begin with the Sumerian peoples, called the civilizations, but never a single unified political entity. You have to think of places like Ur or the Uruk of Gilgamesh as competing city-states that shared a similar culture. I go from the birth of civilizations to the following map. And on this following map, this is telling a couple of stories. It's telling a story of Iraq, and now we get to the actual conflict. From 2014 to 2017. So I go from Sumeria, okay, to a political entity that also see how it formed in the upper Tigris and Euphrates basin. So if I begin our story with the Sumerian civilization that began here, this political entity was known as the Islamic State of Iraq and Syria. And I want you to see how the political confines of ISIS was a terrorist group that claimed it was going to conquer the world. It was going to reconquer Andalusia. It conducted terrorist attacks from San Bernardino to Orlando to Nice and Belgium. But look, for the most part, how its geographical reach was pretty much dictated in this upper area here, known as the Al Jazeera, or the island, okay? Because it really, when the rivers fan out north of Baghdad, it really does form an island, okay? What we noticed was that ISIS's spread was more or less contained. When the river came closer to Baghdad, that's where the Iraqi state made its defense. And of course, its reach ended with the borders of Turkey. What we witnessed here is an episode that, a series of episodes when we're telling the story of water that I called hydroterrorism, the weaponization of water. By hydroterrorism, what do I mean? Here, notice how many dams ISIS was able to control. Hydroterrorism worked along these lines. It's often when enemy forces approached ISIS front lines, often the dams were open, so preventing the enemy armies from besieging ISIS positions by flooding the downstream areas, or conversely, by cutting off water to the downstream area. So that weaponizing water can occur on two ways. It's either you use it to deliberately flood the enemy, and this has happened throughout history. It happened in Ukraine, not this summer, but during World War II, when China resisted the Japanese invasion in the 1930s by deliberately flooding the Yangtze and Yellow Rivers to prevent the advance of Japanese forces. So you either flood to prevent the enemy from advancing, or you deprive the so-called enemy from access to water. And that was the story of ISIS rules from 2014 to 2017, the deliberate weaponization, manipulation of water. Hydroterrorism could also occur with the potential threat of flooding. And the greatest potential threat was this poorly constructed dam here known as the Mosul Dam. And here I introduce you to a term called political ecology, how poor political decisions have ecological ramifications. And this is a theme when we get to Iraqi history. It was Saddam Hussein's decision to build a dam here, where for all intents and purposes, every geological survey said that this is not the ideal spot to build the dam because, number one, the potential collection of water here will undermine the rock foundation of this dam. What does this mean? This dam could collapse at any minute, flooding not only downstream Mosul, but Baghdad itself with a 15-foot high wall of water. What was the fear was that ISIS would deliberately blow it up, okay, were its position in Mosul to weaken. So what was the first target, actually, of the US when it declared war on ISIS was to actually secure the dam. That was its absolute first target. So this is now the story of the weaponization of water. And if you could see here, what else is happening in the background, that you have the cultivation of wheat, cotton, and barley, irrigated land, dates, rice, barley, and vegetables. And just to understand the cultivation of all of these crops and foods are in danger now because the next part of the story. So of course, ISIS was eventually repelled. But the next part of the story begins here. It's the construction of dams upstream in Turkey that really now control the flow of water. So if we look at the story of the Euphrates, the headwaters begin in Turkey. They flow through Syria, and then they reach Iraq. The next river, the Tigris, again, begins in Turkey, eventually reaches Iraq. On some level, there's a word here, and I don't know, it's a word that I have to embed. It's something we could say a kind of form of hydrosecurity. It's not just water security, but what do I mean by hydrosecurity? Iraq doesn't have sovereignty over its water resources on two levels. Neither the rivers that flow through it is a downstream riparian. And on the other level, what I mean by hydrosecurity is this: neither does it have an access to the Gulf here. Its hydro sovereignty is constrained on two levels. Number one, from Turkey in the north, and number two, from Iraq, Kuwait in the south. Now, this is where I would argue water leads to conflict. On one level, And I say one level because wars usually occur due to a multiplicity of variables. The invasion of Kuwait happened for a variety of reasons, but one of the reasons was that for Iraq to become a hegemonic power in the post-Cold War Middle East, it needed access to the port of Kuwait to develop a navy. Iraq doesn't have a deep water port. And another conflict, Iraq's support for a group known as the PKK, the Kurdistan Workers' Party. Because Iraq had no leverage as a downstream riparian, one way to put pressure on Turkey was to support a Kurdish separatist group within the borders of Turkey. Okay. This is an example of the interplay, the interface between water and conflict. So, again, we began with the Sumerians to the 21st century. And if you're interested more in what I described as hydroterrorism, this is an article I wrote in 2015 describing how ISIS weaponized water. It was a tactic I described in 2015. I'm going to show you how it was used to deadly effect in over the last summer. Then I go to another map to tell another story of the Tigris River, and again, putting water central to this narrative, to a town on the Tigris known as Tikrit. And from here, I'm going to tell the story of one of the sons of Tikrit, and you might have heard of him. His name was Saddam Hussein. Okay. Now, how do we explain the rise and history of Saddam Hussein through the story of water? I do it through the following image. The people of Tikrit made their livelihood through the construction of these little inner tubes. They're a bit more sophisticated than the inner tube that you use at Raging Waters. It's a proper river-going vessel. Okay? But this is what the people of Tikrit made their livelihood from, was creating these vessels to traverse the Tigris River, to go from one bank to the other. Okay? Here they are being used more in a ceremonial fashion during COVID to transport medical equipment. Okay. But what's the story of these boats, otherwise known as the Kalak, was this handicraft, this trade was eventually disrupted with the introduction of the steamship. Okay. So you had these traditional makers from Tikrit who made the Kalak all of a sudden out of a livelihood thanks to the introduction of the steamship. And so what happened to these displaced Tikritis was they had to find a new livelihood. And what was a livelihood usually for the dispossessed from rural countrysides, whether it was in Syria or Iraq, was to join the military. Join the military academy and get a job by joining the military. And so sure enough, because of the introduction of the steamship, you had a preponderant amount of Tikritis entering the military academy. This would have been around the 1920s when the Iraqi state was formed. So by the 1940s and the 1950s, most of Iraq's officer corps came from Tikrit. Okay? And that's how Saddam Hussein came to power. Now, Saddam himself could never pass the exam to enter the military academy. He came to power because his cousin was a general in the army. And when his cousin launched a military coup in 1968, Saddam was appointed as the vice president. Okay, but you see the vehicle that explains his rise was the dislocation. It was the story of the Tigris. Now, the irony is, upon becoming president, the president of Iraq, born on the Tigris, himself would weaponize the Tigris in his military career. And now I jump to the event of the 1990s. In an act of punitive political ecology, which has entered our lexicon as ecocide. In the 1990s, Saddam weaponized water in a couple of ways. On the eve of the 1991 Gulf War, he let loose one of the greatest oil spills in the history of the Gulf, assuming that American forces would liberate Kuwait through an amphibious invasion, which in fact was a ruse. The American forces had always planned to attack Iraq's flank. They wanted to give the impression that an amphibious force would land on Kuwait's shores. To prevent that amphibious invasion, think D-Day style type of invasion, Saddam created a deliberate oil spill. One of the greatest acts of political ecocide, the Persian Gulf's coral reefs and maritime, marine life was very delicate. It did horrors to not only the Gulf. The second great act of ecocide, I would argue, was deliberately igniting the oil fields. That was more of an act aimed towards the skies. Deliberately igniting Iraq's Kuwait's oil fields was more or less creating a blazing inferno on Earth. And the next great act of political ecocide, and they're more or less all related, they happened around the same time. A good number of the retreating Iraqi army that was devastated in 6 weeks of aerial bombardment basically went to the marshes to launch an uprising against Saddam Hussein. And the benefit of using the marshes. So now when I'm talking about the marshes, I'm literally talking about the setting of the Sumerian civilization that I began this lecture with. Of course, with marshes, you can't march tanks into marshes, you see. And that's why any rebellion would have began here. A rebellion began here in the medieval Iraq during the Great Abbasid Empire. Okay. A group of African slaves imported from Sudan, Tanzania, and Kenya. There was a Middle Eastern slave trade. And they were imported to Iraq to more or less make the marshes inhabitable. And what you had within the marshes in the 900s was one of the great slave rebellions in history. Think Spartacus in the Middle East. Okay, a state created of people of African descent in the south of Iraq that lasted more or less for 15 years, almost a quasi-communist political entity in the south of Iraq during the Abbasid Empire. Okay, and again, why did the Abbasid Empire have so much trouble putting down the slave revolt? They couldn't send in large armies into the marshes. Armies that primarily consisted of Turkic mercenaries. It was a good place to launch a revolt in the 900s. It's a good place to launch a revolt in the 1990s. So what happens? Saddam creates a series of canals to divert the waters of the Tigris and the Euphrates into the marshes, drying it up. Okay. And look at what the canals were called. The mothers of all battles River was the euphemism for the 1991 Gulf War. That's what Saddam Hussein called the Gulf War. Okay, so more or less, the marshes, this eco habitat that was a UNESCO World Heritage Site, was deliberately destroyed. This is what I call punitive ecocide. The ramifications of that are being felt to this day. Also, the waters were restored by destroying the canals after 2003, okay? But this is the thing with Mother Nature, is once damage is done, it's really hard to repair. And I'll just give you an example of how hard this is. When the Mongols invaded Iraq in 1258, Iraq had such a delicate irrigation system that after the horrors of 1258, the successors never really knew how to restore that irrigation system in the pre-Mongol era. Okay, it was basically the destruction was so profound and so widespread. Basically, the knowledge of creating that delicate, intricate canal system entered oblivion. So now, how do I make the story of the marshes kind of relevant to you? Okay, well, I want you to think of this, and now I'm going to start using the tropes of civilization as well as you to think of this. Look how PBS is telling you what these marshes represent. I mean, on one level, you could think of it as the birthplace of quote unquote civilization, but also think of it as a backdrop of a good number of the biblical narratives that in this area. What's happening here? Why is it becoming a salty wasteland? Well, I just want you to think. When downstream rivers meet against the sea and the flow is disrupted, what's going to happen? The sea starts to go upstream. And this is called salinization. And this is a story not just here. I'm going to tell you a bunch of different waterways where this is happening in the Middle East. So on one level, that's what the marshes represent. And how is that related to act of a political ecocide? Was this when they were drained? Okay, the salinization began. And when the Italian government more or less became involved to help Iraq restore the marshes, it's still very hard to this day to undo the legacy of Saddam Hussein. Okay, and of course, so if I use that PBS headline, okay, you can see here what they're doing on this map of Iraq is more or less trying to lay out where the hypothetical, where the Garden of Eden, according to the Bible, if we read the book of Genesis as a historical source, where it could have been, corresponding to modern day Iraq today. Okay, look at another term where this land is called Eden. Okay, again, we have multiple references of Eden. The notion that this is the cradle of civilization, I would say, is a useful fiction. It's a useful trope. Now, in this case, this article is about a community in Iraq that I believe I would fight for to be declared a living UNESCO heritage. And this is the small Mandaean community. And here I'm just showing a couple of pictures. This is a community that for most all intents and purposes is a remnant of a form of what I would argue Gnostic Christianity in the Middle East. A community that reveres John the Baptist as the true Messiah rather than Jesus. A community that has to live along next to flowing water because baptismal rites are key to their identity. And it's a community that even on our campus, you have alumni at the San Diego State University that come from this community. Could I highlight you? Do you mind if I? Yes, so Sammy is a San Diego State graduate and also somebody who comes from this very small community in Iraq. Now, a community whose identity is tied to the rivers of Iraq. You can see how the creation of upstream dams, okay, increasing temperatures, and some of the highest temperatures on Earth, you have to understand, if you thought this summer was hot, there were parts of Iraq that reached temperatures up to 150 degrees, some of the highest recorded temperatures in the history of keeping records of temperatures was faced in Iraq. So you have to imagine what are these rivers facing is not only the damming process means less flow, higher temperatures means higher evaporation, okay? But then here comes the political ecology, is that the Iraqi state is also denying access to this community, to property along the rivers, because these are now becoming much more strategic in their value, okay? And so there, again, I just wanted to show you kind of some of the traditions of one of the Middle East's diminishing populations, because not only are the rivers diminishing, this community faces a lot of persecution because they were historically associated with the practice of magic, as well as the silver and the gold trade. So this is Sammy. Who is this?
My great-grandfather.
Okay, your great-grandfather is on in this painting here, but often they're targeted because they're assumed by various militias of having a lot of wealth. And thus, what is happening then in this particular case is quite fascinating, because now that I've told you this story, okay, I want to go back to this image. Yeah, it just disappeared.
Okay, maybe it just turns off.
That's okay. So that's why I'm kind of guessing on this. Sorry. This makes life a lot easier. Yeah. Okay, there you go. Now I want to put kind of a story together. Imagine if your livelihood, and in terms of a class on the economics of inequality, I want to tell you the story of two sets of farmers. Imagine if your life as a farmer was based on herding cattle in the marshes. And we saw already just how in this small city here, how the steamship kind of disrupted a traditional trade. The marshes, the traditional trade is fishing, herding cattle, making boats, creating dairy products from the cattle. So what happens as a result of Saddam's actions? With climate change and the failure to restore the marshes, you have a lot of displaced farmers from the marshes who happen to belong to a particular sect in Iraq. They belong to the Shia sect. Around here in Raqqa, in what is Syria, you had the same phenomena, a good number of displaced farmers. And again, the product of poor management, political ecology. If these displaced farmers are living the legacy of Saddam Hussein, here they're living the legacy of the Al-Assad family. The incumbent government in Syria decided they wanted to make Syria self-sufficiently able to produce cotton and export it. And they never learned a lesson from this former Soviet Union, that when the Soviet Union tried to create a cotton economy in places like Uzbekistan, it basically led to the drying up of the Aral Sea. Well, cotton is very water intensive. So what happened was the state managed decision of trying to create cotton around Raqqa. What happened? It led to the depletion of the aquifers. And then to make matters worse, that was political ecology, drought set in. This is around 2006, 2007, 2008. So I want you to imagine a lot of displaced farmers from the countryside ended up crowding into urban centers like Raqqa, dispossessed, displaced. Okay, the same thing with the marshes. Okay, now when 2011 happens, where people now finally have the courage to protest against the governments in the Middle East in a series of events known as the Arab Spring, you could imagine a lot of dispossessed farmers who already had grievances against the government were more than willing to take to the streets as well. A good number of the dispossessed farmers from Raqqa eventually joined an armed movement that was offering salaries. That armed movement was known as the Islamic State. And the Islamic State was able to recruit among dispossessed farmers and then make a lightning attack towards Baghdad. Who came to the defense of Baghdad? It wasn't the army collapsed. Who came to the defense of Baghdad were Shia militias. Shia militias that were more or less recruited overnight, primarily from who? The dispossessed farmers from the marshes. And so I'm telling you a story of ISIS, but from a very different angle. A story of the two rivers, dispossession, how drought and political ecology played a role. That you could have a dispossessed farmer fighting for the Shia militias, fighting against a Syrian dispossessed farmer, fighting for ISIS on the same front line. So, now the next phenomenon. With the increased droughts, with political ecology that drained the marshes, what you have is you have a lot of dry former lake beds. And that is great fodder for sandstorms. Okay, that's what the wind likes to pick up to create sandstorms. And so just to describe, and again here I said, even though this is a trope created by an American archaeologist, just like biblical Eden, it's great for at least to get people concerned about what's happening in this region. What's the danger of a sandstorm? Well, let me describe it to you. This is a picture I took of a sandstorm in Iraq, okay? So just you have to imagine this. When the sandstorm comes, it usually comes without warning. And it's really hard. It's not like a hailstorm. Once it comes, it's very hard to find cover. So I just want to imagine just what you're looking at, literally covered in sand. It will penetrate everything you are wearing, okay? And this is it. That's a mosque in the background. This is in Baghdad. And then comes the sand pellets, okay? And that there's even words in both Persian and Arabic to describe when a sandstorm comes, that these are just more or less pellets of sand that are pelting you. So it's about for 20 minutes where you have no vision. And you can see some people here, I'm running for cover. These people here are just used to it, right? And here it comes. But you have to realize, and then it passes. This is at 3 p.m. in the day. You can understand that. And that was a sandstorm that lasted for 20 minutes. Okay. Imagine that was in 2010. Imagine the same phenomena. So about 20 minutes, and look at the havoc I described to you. Imagine this happening now for about maybe 5 days at a time. This has never happened in Iraq's history, sandstorms of this intensity. And again, it's because of the confluence of rising temperatures, evaporation, exposed lake beds, okay? 5 days, that means Baghdad's airport isn't working. They have people actually facing health conditions because of inhaling sand. These are unprecedented phenomena in the history of the region. Okay, now, so as I'm starting to finish up now, how do I tell the story again through a gendered lens, okay? When I wrote this, it was on the 20-year anniversary of the Iraq War. It was the March 8th, 2023. How does this disproportionately affect women? Well, let's go back to the marshes. If those dispossessed farmers were mobilized in Shia militias, what does that mean, both in Raqqa or in the marshes? You have a lot of widows. Imagine a whole generation coming from a single geographical area who get killed. Okay. What does this mean? Is that those dispossessed farmers, now women become head of household and are left to deal with these problems that are only getting worse from climate change. So here comes now the next part of the story. Climate migration, when you think of climate migration, you might think of epic scenes from the Dust Bowl and the Great Depression. These are smaller micro stories happening almost on a daily basis. I already told you a bit of these micro stories happening in Syria, the cotton cultivation, people moving into urban centers like Raqqa. It's happening in Iraq on a daily basis. It's happening throughout the Middle East. And when the water dries up, you usually try to make your living in the urban center. And usually these dispossessed farmers live on the margins of society. Now imagine if you're a widow going into these urban centers, trying to make a living in these settings. That's how I would argue climate change disproportionately affects women. You might not realize it because we take it for granted, the ability to get water. Most people in these areas would have to get to water by walking to where the water is. The more water disappears, the walk to get that water is even further. Now, I want you to think through the lens of gender-based violence. Then, usually, if you don't have any male members of your household, who is usually getting the water is usually a female head of household or the daughters of a family. And basically, this is a story that more or less, when water gets scarce, that makes you more vulnerable to be attacked while you're seeking out your daily water, never mind your daily bread. So this is on one element that I'm looking at, just basically from a gendered lens. A lot of female head of households, we tend to forget, even with beekeeping, for bees to produce honey, of course, what do you need? You need water to create the flora and fauna that bees feed off of, right? So these are entirely widows. Their husbands were either mobilized by ISIS trying to find new livelihoods. This is in the north of Iraq where their livelihoods are now being threatened from the lack of access to water, again, due to droughts or simply not enough water coming down through the rivers. And again, when we look at kind of unequal access to the water, what happened to those African slaves that I told you about that revolted in the 900s? They're still in Iraq and they still also live on the margins of society. In other words, when water gets scarce, okay, it's communities like these. Okay. And here particularly, I made a comparison in this article. I wrote this article for Black History Month, the story of the Afro-Iraqis. If you want a good equivalent story is the story of Afro-Colombians, okay? That's a good kind of transnational comparison. Climate apartheid was a term coined by the now deceased Archbishop Desmond Tutu, who argues that with climate change, structural inequalities in society means different segments of societies will face the brunt of climate change disproportionately. With a temperature of 150 degrees, you have to think at nighttime it's 100 degrees in Iraq. The only way to live in these kind of conditions is with an air conditioner. But you have to assume for an air conditioner to work, you need electricity. And for those, Iraq still 20 years after the Iraq War does not have a reliable electric grid, which means the only way to fuel the air conditioner is if you can afford your own generator. To afford your own generator, you need fuel, particularly diesel fuel. Iraq's Afro-Iraqi community lives in the most southern part of the country, the hottest part of the country, and do not have access to either air conditioning, generator, never mind fresh access to water as well. And now the other great transformation that's happening in Iraq. A ceremony known as Ashura is the quintessential, the most important event for Iraq's Shia. And more or less, Ashura is about a collective trauma where a figure in the history of Islam known as Imam Hussein fought a battle, was ambushed by a military much larger than his, and Hussein and his immediate family were denied access to water. This happened around 680. It's an event commemorated every year according to the Muslim calendar amongst Shia, but not just Shia, even Iraqi Sunnis and Christians take part in this ceremony. But the key theme of being denied access to water during this battle is now being used to critique the Iraqi state. that Ashura basically saying in the historical episode of the ambush of this family who's denied water is now being a critique launched at the Iraqi state for failing to do the same. So I talked about Syria and how, again, an act of political economy led to its displacement on the eve of its civil war. And here's just another article I highly recommend about climate change and the Syrian civil war. And then now a conflict we're all living through at this very moment. And notice we're just making our way through the geography of the Fertile Crescent. So we're going to make our way to Egypt. If you want to understand, here is the various aquifers in Palestine, Israel. But you have to understand in this particular case, even though this is where Gaza is and the current fighting, and there's places such as Ashkelon I mentioned here, tragically 95% of the water in this aquifer is unusable. And again, it goes to the same problem of desalinization. Okay, so what's going on here? You have a military conflict, but alongside with this military conflict, all right? During military conflicts, often sewage facilities are targeted. Because of this border here, that means water is usually taken from wells, not in very sustainable manners. Okay. And so as a result, look at what this article was saying back in 2019. Gaza was having a water crisis that was so bad it might be uninhabitable by 2020. So imagine that's already due just to poor water management of administrations on both sides of the border. That was when Hamas was controlling Gaza, as well as the Israeli state on the other side of the border. Both were conducting unsustainable water practices, okay? But now combine that with the current crisis. So not only was the aquifer not being used properly, that led to desalinization of the aquifer underneath the soil. Back in 2020, this place was going to be considered uninhabitable due to a water crisis. You have that crisis. The fact that water had to be purchased from Gaza beyond this border from Israel proper. Water had to be purchased from the Israeli national water carrier. Okay? And then combine that with the fact that if this was a problem, imagine if water is cut off entirely to Gaza on the eve of the current crisis. And when I say the water is cut off, literally it's 3 pipes that connect Gaza to the Israeli water carrier. It's just very simple to turn off the switch. And there you have the weaponization of water as well, I would argue. Water has always formed a backdrop, not only between tensions between Palestinians and Israelis, but even conflicts like the 1967 war was over Israeli attempts to divert water. A group that would later be known as the Palestine Liberation Organization, a faction with it known as Fatah, led by at that time a person named Yasser Arafat. Its very first military attack was on a water diversion facility in Israel proper. And so you see, again, that's kind of the story of how water forms a backdrop to these conflicts. And finally, now I work my way to Egypt. If you look at this book chapter I wrote for a book at that time, this was a very new subject, looking at national security and climate change. It was published around 2009. And look at what I'm describing here for the first time, the idea that there's such a thing as climate security. If you look at 2008, look at the quote I used there. The mood of the people is angry. I think it's near collapse, the state, okay? And a lot of it had to do simply with the price of bread, grain prices, okay? And of course, for all of you who don't know, by 2011, this becomes one of the contributing factors that led people to the streets in Egypt, was access to reliable bread. If I zoom out now, as we finish our journey on the Fertile Crescent, you could see, you get an idea of just how much of Egypt is the Nile itself. And like I said, we take for advantage having air conditioners, but when heat waves happen in places like Egypt, sometimes these are the only options you have. Imagine if the electricity cuts. And now just the equivalent of Turkey for Iraq, for Egypt, one of the upstream riparians is Ethiopia. Okay. So imagine if this water, okay, is now controlled by a dam, then Egypt would face the same loss of hydrological sovereignty that Iraq does. So much so that water becomes securitized. Now, what do I mean by the securitization of water? Is the minute you describe it as a national security interest. So much so that you would basically use this issue to mobilize the Egyptian military to pressure Ethiopia, not to basically prevent Egypt from getting its normal supply of Nile water. The last time Egypt and Ethiopia went to war was in the 1800s when Egypt was almost a quasi-empire and it actually bordered Ethiopia. In the 1300s, access to Nile water in Egypt was something that was led to conflicts. The Grand Ethiopian Renaissance Dam wasn't created and filled until September of this year. So if you want to talk about another conflict on the horizon, here it is. And then finally now we end our journey neighboring next to Egypt, a place called Derna in Libya. If we talk about as the year 2023 comes to an end, in the Levant, in that contested territory between Israel and Palestine, if we look at all the fatalities, we're reaching numbers up to 10,000 within the span of a month. In Derna, 10,000 people died in a day due to a dam that collapsed. A dam that was built by the former Yugoslavia. A good number of the Middle East dams were built by the former Yugoslavia as a policy because the former Yugoslavia offered aid as part of the non-aligned movement. Even though it was ruled by a communist party, it was technically not part of the Soviet alliance. It was definitely not part of the US alliance. That appealed to a good number of states. Now, if you don't know about the former Yugoslavia, that tells you then you probably realize you're too young to realize. The former Yugoslavia began unraveling after the Cold War in the 1990s. If the former Yugoslavia unraveled, imagine their dams.
Sure.
The dams are fine, but the thing is about dams is they need to be maintained. Okay, and the problem with Derna in eastern Libya was Libya itself became the fate of a good number of states in the Middle East. Just like there's one more country I'm going to talk about, and that's Yemen. Okay, it has a rival rebel government in the east. Okay, Derna for that reason suffered a lack of governance. Okay, and this was the question. Not only were not sufficient warnings given that the Derna Dam could collapse, but what did Derna face? Again, another anomalous weather event, a Mediterranean hurricane. So anomalous, a new word has to enter our lexicon, a medicane, a Mediterranean hurricane. So in other words, not only was the dam not being maintained, but you had an anomalous weather event that struck Greece, Turkey, and then later Libya. Combined with what's also happening, unusual amounts of forest fires that are now afflicting the Mediterranean. This is what climate change is looking like in our lifetime. And finally, I'll end our story with Yemen. Yemen is the good reason why all of this is desert. It has to do with the monsoon winds. When the monsoon winds hit, Yemen is a very high mountainous area. And when the monsoon weather hits the mountains of Yemen, usually the water is kind of fertilizes Yemen, leaving all of this area as desert. Okay, this mountainous area is good for growing historically frankincense, incense, and as well as another crop that grew there. And so you can just I want you to get an idea of what the wadis of Yemen look like. This is an area known as the Hadramaut. And you can see all of this is fertilized thanks to the phenomena of the monsoon winds and flash floods. And if you see if there's any disruption to monsoon patterns that are happening as we speak, how precarious life is in the Hadramaut. You probably know the most famous son of the Hadramaut of these Yemen valleys, the family last name, and talk about life being precarious and migration due to overpopulation. The Bin Laden family came from Yemen and migrated to Jeddah in Saudi Arabia, where Mohammed bin Laden made his fortune. The Bin Ladens are a Yemeni family from the Hadramaut. This is where the bin Ladens would have come from. And you can get an idea again of a kind of entire lifestyle dependent on the flash flood. And if you look at Yemen, these are the river valleys of Yemen, the wadis. But most of Yemen is mountainous, extremely mountainous. And in high elevation, a particular crop can grow. A particular crop that you don't need actually pesticides for. This is a crop that grows on high mountains and it has a built-in pesticide, which makes it perfect for pre-modern farming communities. Does anyone know what this crop is? It's a crop so much in demand, you have to wait about 20 minutes to get it at Starbucks. Yeah, the coffee bean. Its pesticide is, we call it caffeine. For bugs, they don't like it. For us, it's heaven. But in theory, remember, if you have too much caffeine, it can kill you. It is a pesticide, if too much doses. Now, where did the coffee bean reach the international market? Is in this Yemeni town here. And obviously, if it's in disarray, that means somehow other countries took over it. This town is called Macha. You pronounce it as Mocha. It's not the thing, again, they charge $6 for it to give you a little chocolate thing. It's just simply the place in Yemen where the coffee bean was shipped out to. Of course, Yemen could not compete. You need high particular altitudes to grow the Cafe Arabica, right? And I want you to think, where is coffee grown? Usually high altitudes of Costa Rica, Brazil, Colombia, okay? Yemen couldn't compete. And for that reason, they switched to another product. But that's why a cup of Yemeni mocha, a bag of it costs $62. You're getting it from its original site, and it's the world's first coffee. Because coffee was no longer cultivated in Yemen, they moved to another crop. That's not matcha. This is a mild narcotic known as pot. And the thing about pot is it's a mild narcotic. The entire country got addicted to it, okay? And it's extremely water intensive. So when this article came out in 2014, why is there a civil war breaking out in Yemen, okay? Because it's poor and thirsty. Again, so much water was diverted for pot cultivation that when governance broke down and Yemen became divided into 3 different governments, okay, again, would you have sustainable depletion of aquifers? Okay. And then this is the next story of our class, is usually when water isn't managed, waterborne diseases emerges. And now our story comes full circle, that Egypt's Elvis died because of a waterborne diseases, but a phenomenon, cholera, is all of a sudden now a problem in Syria and Yemen. Hepatitis A, acute diarrhea. When the dam burst in Derna, the survivors faced a lot of waterborne diseases. Okay. So we are entering the 21st century where water has been weaponized. Okay. This article here I wrote about hydroterrorism. That's Ukraine. And this was deliberate. And remember, this is the weaponization of water affects. This is about sentient security. It not only affects us, affects animals downstream. There was an entire zoo in Ukraine that got flooded as a result of the weaponization of water. But finally, this is a matter you're interested in. I can't recommend this source highly. This is what good German taxpayer money gives. If you have to do a project here, it's called the Environment, Conflict, and Cooperation. For the Hansen Chair in Peace, I can't think of a better database than this, where if you click the URL, it's really just brilliant. Just pick a place. Let's go here. Let's go here. Okay. How does water play as a problem here? It gives you the conflict history, the background, the actors, attempts at conflict resolution, the role of civil society. That's one of the best databases I ever used. So, there is a room for optimism. I have to go back in time to a different place. Okay, misreading the story of climate change and the Maya. And what does Kenneth remind us of? Okay. That whether it's the Bronze Age collapse, the collapse of the classical Maya, okay, there's usually interrelated long-term trends: population growth, warfare, complex bureaucracy, declining rainfall. Okay, But at the end of the day, we also have to realize that there was a story of perseverance, generations facing mounting challenges. Who are the perseverers in the Middle East? Okay. Well, they include multilateral attempts, the World Food Program. There's stories of scientists and engineers, attempts to fight back. Mangroves, for example, you probably don't realize are the ecological heroes in the story. Mangrove forests are not only carbon sinks, but they prevent desalinization coming in, usually inland. Okay. There's stories like this. There's the sandstorms, yet there are the Iraqi environmentalists, such as Jassim al-Assadi. And when I say perseverance, you have to realize in places like Iraq, environmentalists like Jassim are often kidnapped, if not executed, because usually they're taking on vested interests in the Ministry of Water. And usually I would think, who would ever kidnap an environmentalist or target an environmentalist? But then I think of, Greta, right? Do you remember the fight she got into with this very toxic male guy? Who was that guy who was fighting her?
Andrew Tate.
Yeah, Andrew Tate. If Andrew Tate had a militia, he would have killed Greta. But the sad thing is, Jassim al-Assadi was kidnapped in broad daylight outside of Baghdad in February 2023, 20 years after the Iraq War. This guy could be kidnapped, he was tortured and eventually released, okay? There are water heroes, such as this woman here named Habiba, who's also my aunt. I began this story with who my mom was named after, who is considered a water hero. In this case, she works within the United Arab Emirates. She created one of its first environmental groups in its history. And again, I just want you to say that this story is not about a far off place, but the story I'm telling is also the story of the local. And on this note, hopefully I could use this chance to advertise on 2 occasions. I'm happy to say that hopefully at San Diego State, next semester, I'll be teaching a class called Plagues Through the Ages. And it's a history of disease. And of course, the greatest plague through the age, of course, is this relationship with water and malaria. Okay. And this is also the Middle East's future. As temperatures get higher, a lot of the Middle East is going to be opened up to malaria. But this is also a story, like I said, bacterial and chemical evidence of coastal water pollution right here. It's not only a story that's local, but it's happening every day in the Middle East as well. So definitely look out for that class, Plague Through the Ages. And then finally, to conclude, if you want to understand more about Iraq, please come to Thursday's event. That's also sponsored by the Hampton Chair, where you'll have 3 people looking at the legacy. I discussed a good number of them, why Iraq matters. It's a biblical homeland, the story of our civilization, but it also could be, if we tell the story that civilization began in Iraq, leading us onto this path of modernity. I'm doing this quote unquote. But this might also be the sad thing, is that the civilization as we know it might begin unraveling in Iraq as well. And that's kind of the sad note I have to end on. But thank you for attending, and I leave it open to any questions.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah, we have some time for questions.
So your Plagues Through the Ages course I know we'll be teaching next semester. What would that be listed under? Like what?
School of Public Health, and I'm learning GEN.
Okay.
I think about the School of Public Health. So if you need a science combination of humanities courses, combination of public policy course, definitely look that up, or just also email me if you want. If you Google me, definitely Google me, and I could just give you the link.
And then for the people in my class, I can look it up and
Please, yeah, I'll
put
send
it
you
there
the link.
and the same.
Yeah. But that's one of my other passions. If you enjoyed this approach, how the story of disease forms the backdrop of our history as well. I can't recommend it more.
Yeah, in the back.
I think what is given that you can take all the bodies of water, bring them into these countries, when solar energy to produce salinate. In other words, literally bring the ocean water in. Again, use renewable and provide the energy to be salinated.
Okay, so it's being done, but I'll tell you, but your question brings up a greater point. Those kind of desalinization projects are done in the Gulf states. They're extremely expensive. So on one level, there's a cost that in kind of the long term, it's still cheaper maybe to import water than develop the desalinization infrastructure. But like I said, they're being done in the Gulf states, but you're bringing up a greater question. And I think I heard the word cooperation. And this is really the problem, the crux at it. There are no riparian regimes where, let's say, Turkey, Syria, Iraq, and let's not forget neighboring Iran can agree and cooperate on the flow of water and its distribution. The same problem when I talked about Egypt and Ethiopia, a lot of saber rattling. There are kind of bodies to regulate it, but there hasn't been a history of creating cooperative riparian regimes in the region. Okay. Jordan, the Jordan River, I can't think of a better example of how there's a lack of history of cooperation. But ideally, there would be some kind of collaborative efforts, but collaboration with water resources is not just a problem in the Middle East, but throughout the world. So it's unfortunate, but that's what's needed.
Would you say that a reason why they haven't, so this hydroterrorism that's been going on, it's fixable, but since the people in power don't want to fix it because they have that control over the people?
It's a form of power. Well, let's take the case of ISIS. How could you best guarantee the loyalty of people living in the Islamic State? Was give them reliable services, give them reliable water. And that's what one person in the Iraqi government said. That is ISIS's greatest weapon, was the ability to deliver reliable water. That's what kept people happy and content. And just give them protection. So definitely that is one part of the equation of kind of hydroterrorism, was use it to mobilize and keep your base happy. And that's a way of cementing loyalty between your constituents. A very, very good argument.
I have a question. So building on the idea of building a shared governance agreement, can the African Union play a part, especially along Ethiopia, Egypt, Sudan, and then also especially because Egypt has an economic interest in the survival, economic and population interest in the survival of
I mean, it's a good, because when you think of the African Union, it's also, so we're talking about multilateral organization. The African Union has raised peacekeeping forces. They have been deployed in Africa. But I'll say this, the Middle East also has its equivalent in form of the Arab League. And the Arab League has been, it's very hard for the Arab League, for example. So we're talking about multilateral governance, right? The Arab League was never successful, let's say, in getting Syria and Iraq to cooperate, even though both members are a party to this multilateral organization. So in this case, the African Union has never been successful in creating a riparian regime as well. Ideally, this is where it happened. But so if we're looking at kind of North Africa, the Sahel and Sub-Saharan Africa, as well as the Middle East, the multilateral organizations haven't had a success in it. Ideally, this is where it would happen. It's been elusive so far. And you get the idea, if you control the headwaters, this is sovereignty, right? I mean, for some levels, this is, this term I invented, hydrological sovereignty. You have to give up a bit of it when you make an agreement with a multilateral organization. So you. In the back, and then I go forward.
I was just wondering if there was able to be some type of world organization that was able to do a collective protection on water. You think that, because with if I know multiple places are struggling with freshwater issues, but it does seem like a global problem. So do you think there's any possibility for a collective?
I came up for a term of that. If there was a NATO, if only there was a climate alliance treaty organization. So to answer your question, if I had to invent the organization, it really doesn't exist.
Right.
But you see the need for it.
Right.
And that's why I came up with this hypothetical, a Cato instead of a NATO. Yeah, that's what would be great.
It could be.
Hypothetically, it could be, yes. Or there is a need for it.
Yes.
Yes. Yes, absolutely. So I saw a question there. Yeah.
Yeah, if you could recommend a book or two on like just political ecology or geopolitics and conflicts, like what would you recommend to the class? For, like,
So a good book is lacking. I gave you a lot of small articles I've written. A really good book, particularly when it comes to the Middle East. I'm going to be shameless. This book is already out of date. Okay, I wrote 2 chapters on Turkey and Egypt. This was the first book to get the discussion going, at least in the US. Looking at the relationship between climate change and national security, but like that, we were projecting in the future. And what blows my mind, how's that even projecting a decade? A lot of our projections were wrong. All right, so that's how fluid this organization is. I am writing, I just sent it off to the publisher, A Concise History of the Middle East, the 13th edition, where it ends with a political ecological history of the Middle East. So if you Google me, I'll just send you the draft of that chapter. But you're absolutely right. Oh yeah, of course, I do have the best book for you. The best book is, his name is Joshua Busby. He's at University of Texas. Joshua Busby is, and he just came out with a book. It's published by Cambridge University Press. Let's see what it is. I can't recommend it. And a lot, States and Nature. That's the best book out there. And when I say it's the best book, this entire talk was more or less informed by his framework. So he's a political scientist. He writes a lot in foreign affairs. But his work, Drought in the Middle East, Cyclones in South Asia, Beyond Internal Conflict, the Next Decade. Yeah, that's the book you want to read. So I'm glad you asked me that. Yeah, I can't recommend him higher. And he's just a very nice guy. And he has a blog as well. So even if the book is a little bit out of date, his blog is really good. It's called The Duck of Minerva, if I'm not mistaken. Yes.
So this is kind of like US role in Israel and Palestine. So having taken a history class on it and writing my final paper on water rights in Israel versus abuses happening to Palestinian people, does the US have a role in kind of reshaping the water security and justice for Palestinian people? Because in the occupied territories, when Israeli settlers come in, they often have carte blanche rights to the water versus Palestinians, like you said, having very few access, as well as having, there's a law that says they can't drill any
new wells, yeah.
or get access to any new waterway. So does the US have a role in ensuring that there is some type of solidified water security and justice for the Palestinian people?
Let me put it this way. Can the US government tell us not to water our lawns? We would have an uprising, even if our local government said no more green lawns, even though they're hugely water intensive. So to give you the details, I actually talk about the water discrepancies in this article here. I'll just give you one very recent example. Remember before the ground invasion of Gaza began, Israel cut off the water. And I think it was US pressure that got them to get the pipes going. That is just the most recent example. But again, this gets into issue of hydrological sovereignty. Could Israel tell Israelis, you know, this is how much water you should use, this is how much water you should give the Palestinians? Of course not. We can't even imagine it in our own San Diego County, for example. The county gives us incentives to kind of use less water intensive technology. So imagine trying to adopt this agenda in the future. It's a really good question. Talking about inequality, economics of inequality.
Well, that actually inspires something I was thinking about is, does the regime type matter in terms of when we, I was thinking about your examples of ecocide in Iraq, where that's very much an authoritarian state, but now you've just given an example of democracy being unable to enact any kind of sort of regulations to better preserve these water restrictions. So, I mean, is there an ideal regime type for what we need to get to, or is there a one that we should try to move away from that leads to the worst kinds of outcomes?
So to best answer your question, I'll go to the anarchist historian, Seeing Like the State, how certain schemes to improve the human condition have failed, where he makes this argument that usually kind of with the dictatorial states, you have these kind of dystopian outcomes. Right? Think the great famines in China, so on and so forth. Yeah, then, so that's the other book I recommend. But then on the other extreme, is there an ideal type? Democracies at the same time can barely manage their own citizens and resources. And so I think that's where we are right now. We're in this kind of vacuum in terms of what is the best forms of government. It's like what that student asked, if there was a kind of global regime.
You need a global.
It's at the multilateral regimes on the levels. And this is, I think, kind of in the history of governance. We're having to invent not only the terms, but the modes of governance, along the fly, so to speak, and promptly, in an impromptu fashion. And I think that's where we're at right now. That's why, progress hasn't been made.
Well, this has been, we have time for one more. Yeah.
You talked about, people who have been affected, and like the kidnapped environmentalists in Baghdad. And it had me thinking, this is probably straying away from the history discipline to the art discipline, which is my own background. It had me wondering if there are any creative interventions to, this crisis. And I'm asking because I recently started to do comparative analysis of these interventions between countries in South America like Brazil, and then in Africa like Nigeria, which is my home country. So is there anything that you'd like to?
Yeah. Again, it's kind of the way I try to end about local actors, kind of the perseverance, giving agency to it. This is quite an interesting example of using a religious ceremony and subverting it as a way of critiquing the state. Absolutely. Has there been artists, Palestinian artists, talking about the difficulty in terms of accessing water throughout the region, kind of examining themes of desertification? Now, this is a problem. If only I could get a name in mind, but if you look at, I wish I had the author. Her name is Zainab Shukr. She's really good at this, looking at civil society activists and how do they use art, for example, to protest inequality or unequal access to water, for example. It's definitely a theme amongst artists in the Middle East. Absolutely. There's a similar equivalent.
All right. Thank you so much for everybody for attending. Great lecture, great question and
Thank
answer
you for your
session.
questions. Yeah, I appreciate it.
That's great.
Well, I'll just give you my email. That's easier.
I actually am enrolling for my class when I get.
PH 3.
I think they were asked about it earlier.
Yeah.
That's for the handy.
That thing separates all my subjects from me.
What's your major?
Economics.
Okay, so that's a good one.
Yeah.
So it's
Wonderful.
and then my last name, Al-Marashi.
Yeah, no, we're absolutely. That's
R-A-S-H-I.
I am too.
Yeah, all right. Thanks for coming.
Good deal.
Yeah.
See you Thursday.
See you then.
SM, your sister conference, .edu. Just email me there and I'll give you the link.
Thank you
Right,
so
thank you,
much.
no, thank you for your questions. Likewise, thank you.
That was my interest. Being here.
New? It looks new.
New word.
Conversation.
Yeah.
Sneaking in here like that. All right, I see you.
See you coming.
And if you can't get the water to the people are gonna go to the water.
Thank you.
So, if they want to avoid mass migration, which is what I think it ultimately will happen. They've got to